For Martin Luther, it was only an excuse. By the time the Indulgences were preached in Germany, not yet contradicted by Martin Luther at all, he had long decided that he was not capable of living up to his vows. With now his discipline lacking more and more, with his religious life lacking more and more, with his becoming constantly more sinful, with his falling into despair over his own sins, long before he was a real Protestant, he said that he would go to hell because he would never be able to dominate his vices. The despair moved him to lower the ideals. And he started to preach the new doctrine. The new doctrine not yet talking about indulgences at all. The new doctrine not yet talking about a corrupt Renaissance, lusty Rome yet. He would just preach and say, you cannot get rid of your vices by doing penance. You cannot get rid of them by praying. You cannot get rid of them by doing good works. You cannot get rid of them. There is no human way of getting rid of your vices. Therefore, it can't be true what the church teaches about penance, what the church teaches about discipline, what the church teaches about confession, and what the church teaches about, and there we are, indulgences. There is no way to get rid of your vices. You are stuck in them. There is no way of improving your life. You are condemned to be a sinner. Of course, his superiors were appalled when they heard about it. And they told him, said, you cannot say these things in public, let alone on the pulpit. He went on, proud as he was, again, he did not heed the advice. He did not obey his superiors. He went on and on. Now, in 1517, finally it happened. The famous publication of the thesis, the 95 Theses of Luther, at the Schlosskirche zu Wittenberg. I don't know what is all the fuzz about those 95 Theses. In those days, it was more than common to nail a piece of paper with certain theological theses on your church door in order to provoke a theological discussion and to get into an academic dispute about something. There was no computer, there was no telephone, and there was very, very little of printing yet. So if somebody had a new theological theory, instead of just affirming his own errors, he would write them clearly legibly on a piece of paper, nail that piece of paper to the next church door, and hope that somebody would come along and say, hey, what's the matter with you? And so they would get into a serious and interesting theological discussion, not having a telephone. They would just, after Mass, for example, get together and discuss theology, which is a good thing. So for the moment, there was nothing special in the Herr Dr. Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the church door. The problem was what it said on that paper. First of all, most Protestant authors will confirm that the 95 Theses were incoherent, lousy theology, illogical, and some of them plain polemics. The result was that the superiors told Martin Luther to take back these theses and to abandon the whole issue. That's not the way you talk to Herr Dr. Martin Luther. He went on raging. Now he not only defended these theses, now he went much further. So, to cut a long story short, the whole thing was carried to Rome, and Pope Leo X wrote a document in which he condemned the 95 Theses of Luther. Most of them quoting the thesis, most of them were condemned by quoting the thesis and adding what the church says about it. Martin Luther was a heretic before 1517, as we have seen. Now he became a public heretic. And now, having separated himself from the church, now having gone into rebellion against the church, now having publicly disobeyed his superiors, the rest was the avalanche that had to follow.
Can I interject here, Father?
Yeah.
In my reading, the issue seemed to come down to this. Martin Luther had the right to post his thesis.
Yeah.
The church, if the church disagreed with that,
Yeah.
they would have to take him to a court or tribunal and show that these were incorrect.
No. It was sufficient for his superiors not to allow the publication of these theses. Don't forget, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was not even a secular priest who still has a superior called bishop. Of course, you could not publish any kind of thing there. When we talk about a thesis published, we're talking about what today is called a thesis. On some issue that has not yet been settled in the church, you can always literally write a thesis and get your doctorate for that. I got my doctorate in theology for writing the following thesis. I stated that Gilbert Keith Chesterton was not only writing about theology, but that Gilbert Keith Chesterton was a theologian and a Thomistic theologian as such. That was my thesis. I proved my point and got the doctorate.
So you're saying to me, Father, this, that Luther Luther did not have a right to be judged whether he was correct or incorrect by the church. He was asking them to show where his theses were wrong.
No, the point is that first of all he published his thesis without asking his superiors. In a monastery that was never possible. I couldn't publish my thesis without asking my superiors. I mean, that's just the rules of a university. You don't just write a thesis and nail it to a door. Well, today it means you go to the printer. The point is, first of all, you have to have the theological discussion. So what you could do was, with the agreement of your superiors, you propose your theological opinion on something where theological opinions are still possible. You cannot, for example, publish a thesis against the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. That's why it is a dogma. So in order you do not theologically discuss it anymore.
But indulgences are not that.
Say again?
Indulgences are not on that category.
No, they're not on the category of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, but
he feels, Luther now, my reading, Luther feels that they're only doing indulgence to get money.
Yeah.
They have given that.
Yeah.
They have given that. That job to a certain bishop.
Yeah.
And his job was to get the money.
Yeah. But
Luther says that's wrong.
Yeah, but the point of the 95 Theses that he published was, first of all, by far not the indulgences in the first place. Second, when you bother to read those 95 Theses, you will find that he just attacks the Pope in a way that would never be theologically permitted, in the sense of a theological discussion. What has that got to do with a theological discussion if you publish a thesis?
You're saying, Father, that there are many more things that indulgences.
Oh yes, of course.
That he proposed
of course. That's why I said the indulgences were one point only.
Okay.
Yeah. The point is, for example, he just said, if that Pope there in Rome wants that church built, why doesn't he pay it out of his own pocket? Okay, you might as well ask that question, but that's not a theological thesis to be nailed to the Schlosskirche door of Wittenberg. That's unacceptable, and it was unacceptable, and it is unacceptable. However, once the 95 Theses were published, with the help of many enemies of the church, These theses were widespread. Widespread. There was hardly any learned man left in Europe who wouldn't have heard about those theses. Now, Europe at the time was still Catholic, and you can imagine that the vast majority of people just rejected these things and said, just another crackpot, don't pay attention. Needless to say, politics are something very ancient. But Europe was not yet ready for that. The 95 Theses were published, and as I said, Pope Leo X made it clear what the Church had to say about them. He condemned all 95 Theses, said unacceptable Church doctrine. Usually, that would settle the cause. Roma locuta, causa finita. Once Rome has spoken, the case has ended. Before we start to understand how the Reformation could ever be successful, because in 1517 nobody would have dreamed of that monk becoming famous, we have to see what Luther went on to do. Now, by the time he had realized that he could not possibly control his vices, mainly being the one against the Sixth Commandment, he was long decided to find himself a woman. That was something entirely traditional with him, because before he became a monk already, he tried to propose. When he was a monk, he complained about his still unsatisfied sexual desires. Once he had decided in his mind that it is impossible for a human being to fight vices, he decided to do what he later on made a commandment of his own: go on sinning and go and sin boldly. And he did. First of all, he indulged in the vice against the Sixth Commandment, for which no man needs anybody else, unfortunately. There is temporary documents proving, without any scientific doubt, that he was constantly indulgent in that. Once in the, let's say, constant state of mortal sin, he realized that it was perfectly absurd for him to go to confession, because he'd commit the sin the same day. So he ceased to go to confession, and of course, in order to tranquilize his long ago squandered and smashed conscience, he declared, fresh and proud as he was, he declared that confession is perfectly superfluous. As it is impossible for man to win against sin, there's also no purpose in confession. Once he was loosened to the point that he would abandon the sacraments, not go to confession anymore, not go to communion, it was an automatic consequence that he soon would cease to say Mass, and on the point of Holy Mass.